Welcome to the TMDSAS podcast mini-sode series. In this episode, we'll focus on several different aspects of the application and hear directly from the admissions deans on how information is processed and how you as the applicant can put your best foot forward. Joining us today is the Associate Dean for Admissions at the Texas A&M University College of Medicine, Mr. Philo Maldonado, and the Associate Dean for Admissions and Diversity at the Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center School of Medicine, Dr. Felix Morales. In this episode of the podcast, we'll be exploring what an admissions committee takes away from a letter of evaluation, who you should be asking to write a letter of evaluation for you, and what the difference is between a committee letter that is sent in or a committee packet versus submitting your letters individually. Let's get started. Mr. Maldonado, what does an admissions committee take away from a letter of evaluation?
I don't know about other admissions committees, but we obviously require letters because we think they hold weight and influence our decisions. So they are influential, especially if members of the committee are on the fence with regard to how they're evaluating an applicant. So often what we take away from the letters of evaluation is the level of support or their enthusiasm for the student and to what extent the reviewer, the evaluator believes the applicant has promise or is suitable for not only the practice of medicine, but the training in medicine. And we look for that in the letters. Some letters provide quite a bit of insight into some of these intra and intrapersonal competencies. And the letters that typically do that better than most are the Health Professions Advisory Committee packets for the Health Professions Evaluation. At least for our admissions committee, that carries quite a bit of weight. We consider to be that a valuable source of information and putting the applicant in perspective. Also confirming or verifying some of their activities, and more important, if there are any concerns on the part of the committee, then sometimes those are raised, or if there was a concern and the student reconciled it and made amends, owned up to some issue. Sometimes this happens, that they're still supportive of the applicant because they saw that the applicant grew from that situation and improved, which speaks for the individual's capacity for improvement, for example. So sometimes those kinds of letters gives us insight into not only their interpersonal skills, but obviously the intrapersonal attributes that we think are important. The individual letters are important, and we would not in any way dismiss those, and those sometimes in lieu of, we look at with great interest in lieu of a committee letter. And the reason I say that is that not everyone can submit a committee letter, and that just depends on the applicant and their circumstances. So the individual letters then will carry the same weight as the letter if the applicant is a non-traditional, is returning to school maybe after serving in the military or being in the workforce for a period of time and has had to return to school and so on. And so sometimes the committee option may not be available to them in some instances, depending on how they proceed with their education. In terms of the individual letters, if a student is returned to school, for example, we hope at least one of those letters is from a faculty member. and the others can be from an employer or an associate who maybe worked very closely with that individual, or even a physician or a healthcare provider that they may have shadowed or observed in some capacity. So those are obvious options, for those kinds of applicants that may be more non-traditional, and those would certainly carry some weight. But there's no doubt that the committee is looking first and foremost at letters from faculty who can put in perspective the potential for that student to adapt or acclimate to the intensity of a medical education curriculum. So that one thing that the committee wants to make sure of is that they have the intellectual skills and that they have been, refined enough that they're ready then to make the next leap in their training to medical education. So that's typically what they look for first, is that they have the intellectual capacity to adapt to medical education. And then secondly, to look for those important attributes that we believe are consistent with being a confident, empathetic, and compassionate physician.
And now for Dr. Morales' input. What would you say is the main takeaway that an admissions committee, specifically yours, takes away from the letters of evaluation?
A couple of things, and I wanted to just preface it by saying this. I've been traveling through the Texas swing and the DFW swing for a couple years now, and I've heard some misconceptions about the letters of recommendation, about their importance. And I want to tell you and listeners to this podcast that it is a very critical area, in regards to the review of an application. And I know I mentioned beforehand that the first area I go to is the personal statement, and literally the second area I go to is the letters of recommendation, partly because we want to make sure that the letter writer is reflecting what the student sees in themselves for the first one. And the second thing is, the letter writer also can talk about, that student's, motivation. What has motivated that student to really not only become a good student, but more importantly, their pursuit of becoming a physician. And so, that letter writer, especially if it's a well-written, personalized letter in which the student has really engaged the letter writer and they built a good relationship, it does go a long way in regards to helping that student out. A poorly written letter recommendation often does have some dire consequences, because we don't want to see, I hate to use this phrase, but those rubber stamped type of letters of recommendation where you feel like the letter writer has just basically changed the name on top of the letter for the student. And we want to make sure that that student has been able to build that personal relationship so that letter writer can vouch for that person's character, their level of dedication, and their ability to pursue a medical degree. And so that's the important, and that's how we go about when we review our letters of recommendation on our selection process, just to make sure that that student does have that true sincere interest in becoming a physician.
Excellent points. And I think that's a really nice segue into one of the questions that's been asked a lot in our online communities, especially with our non-traditional applicants. Are the evaluators weighted in certain ways? For example, is a letter from a supervisor who's known me for 5 years better than a letter from a professor from a class that I took 5 years ago?
It's a great question. I like the way you phrased that question. In the context of a person who's a non-traditional applicant, we definitely would value probably the letter of the person who's known them the best for the last 5 years. So if it was a supervisor, type, that letter would probably be valued. Obviously, the professor letter type, we would want to definitely look at, and because they would, kind of vouch for their academic, background. But for the non-traditional letter students, definitely the letters of recognition that we would want are the ones who that student's worked with the most or worked with closest. And so if it was, for example, someone who had had a banking job, and their bank manager wrote them a letter of recommendation, especially if it's one that which demonstrates those characteristics I was talking about, the dedication and motivation, then it would go a long way for that student. And very honestly, very frankly, one of the best letters I personally ever read was from a previous football coach. It was a student who was a college athlete, and the letter was just so well written and so personalized because this coach had got a chance to work with this football player, for 4 years of his academic career. And so for me, there it goes. It goes to who knows you best is probably the best advice I would give to any applicant, and particularly those who are the non-traditional type of applicants.
Excellent. Thank you. And I think it goes to say that for those applicants that are submitting letters individually, they have the opportunity to submit 3 letters, and in addition, 1 additional letter. And so one of the pieces of advice that I share with applicants is to select letter writers who are going to speak to your strengths, but also in different areas. So, for example, you have your academic area, you have your professional area, perhaps somebody who knows you from research or on a personal basis, and really speak to the characteristics that you want to highlight in your application.
Exactly. So we definitely want someone who's going to write, like you said, to their personal strengths and their ability and their confidence to be able to complete any sort of medical school curriculum.
Right. Excellent. Is there anything else that you'd like to share about the letters?
The best advice I give, and obviously if we're talking about different stages of learners, I always tell for the younger students who are in the process of thinking about applying to medical school to start building those relationships with your potential letter writers, whether it be the professor type or the shadowing physician, just to make sure that you're building that personal relationship so they can really write you a good letter of recommendation. I always am fearful that some students will just, show up to a professor after, they complete the course and say, oh, by the way, can you write me a letter of recommendation, which oftentimes might not be reflective, too positively on that student. And then for the, obviously for the opposite in that, for those non-traditional types that have been out of school for a good while, like I said, just building good relationships with those potential letter writers, because we definitely want to make sure that they're, vouching for their character, their work ethic, those types of characteristics that often can, show us that, you, despite you being out of school for a while, your character and work ethic are going to push you through that finish line when as far as getting your medical degree.
Mr. Maldonado's points about how a letter of evaluation is actually influential in the admissions process should really drive home the point that selecting your evaluators carefully is really important to your application. In fact, it may be just as important as the metrics. The enthusiasm and the support that you receive from an evaluator is really going to speak to an admissions committee. And if they reach a point at which they're not sure about how to address your application, how to move forward with decision making, the letter of evaluation is going to play a key component in how an admissions committee makes a decision. Dr. Morales goes on to talk about how you should develop and build your relationships with your evaluators earlier on, and make sure that they speak to your dedication and your ability to be able to handle the rigors of medical school. And this actually applies to medical, dental, or veterinary school, or any professional school that you might be looking into. And while this information isn't new to any of you who have been listening to the podcast, it's important to hear directly from these deans of admissions how these letters are looked at. And so there are several things that you might want to do to make your letter stronger. First, you've heard this several times, is to build that relationship and that rapport with your evaluators. This is not something that can be done quickly or easily, and so it's entirely up to you to develop those relationships. However, once you've found somebody who can be your evaluator, in the description of this episode, we've linked the guidelines for writing a letter of evaluation for a medical school applicant. And it's a one-page brochure produced by the AAMC that shows the key areas of interest that an admissions committee is looking for in an applicant. And this includes what unique contributions you are able to provide the incoming class, and it also goes on to talk about the core level competencies. And so this gives your evaluator the ability to speak the same language that an admissions committee speaks. I'd like to leave you with a bit of advice in selecting your evaluators. In Dr. Brene Brown's book, Daring Greatly, she talks about a quote that President Theodore Roosevelt shared, and I'm going to go ahead and read it to you now. "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man or woman in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end of the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat." And so in her book, Dr. Brown uses this quote to talk about people who are in the arena with you, fighting against all of these critics and all of the voices that are telling you cannot succeed. Close your eyes and imagine yourself in that arena and think about who is in this arena with you. Perhaps it might be a spouse, a parent, a teacher, a professor, your supervisor, a trusted coworker, a longtime friend. These are the people who are going to have your back no matter what. It's important for you to develop a relationship with an evaluator who is going to be in that arena right there with you. And if you can't think of anybody yet, then it's time to get to work. The TMDSAS podcast is a proud affiliate of the MedEd Media Network, your source for informational, inspirational, and motivational pre-med podcasts and more. Check us out at mededmedia.com. If you have any questions or comments about this episode of the podcast, we invite you to join the conversation in our online communities linked in the description of this episode. On behalf of everyone here at TMDSAS, we'd like to wish all of our current and future applicants all the best of luck. That's all for this episode. We'll talk to you later.